for 2019. So if you have take a look at the program placard on the table in front of you, you can see that there are 3 other talks that are scheduled for later this year, and I won't bother going through the details on those with you, but they promise to be very interesting talks as well. Some of the best speakers on the history of science, and especially the history of astronomy and physics this year. So thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks especially to all of the donors who are in the room who support the history programs here at AIP. We really do appreciate the support that we get from all of you. And 2018 was in many ways a banner year for us. We brought in the David Wenner collection of rare books. They are now here. We're now beginning to process those, and that's a project that will take the next year or so to get off the ground. So stay tuned. There's a lot more news coming about the rare book collections here at AIP. And we have on the screen here an invitation, especially for the donors in the room, but for potential donors too, because everyone can be a donor. We have an event on February 20th at the Danish Embassy down close to the observatory off of Massachusetts Avenue. Whitehaven, I think, is the name of the street. And it's a very nice setting where we'll be celebrating the acquisition of the David Wenner collection, but we're also striving to strengthen our connections to a couple of particular institutions in Denmark. The Niels Bohr Archive, which we have to disambiguate from the Niels Bohr Library and Archive all the time. The one with the longer name is here in this building. The one with the shorter name and only the papers, no books, is over in Copenhagen. They're colleagues of ours. We work with them on a number of projects. And in fact, their director, current director, has been a recipient of a number of our grants and aid from the History Center. So we'll be getting together at the Danish Embassy. If you would like to come along, you can sign up on a clipboard that Marianne over here is going to be sending around the room. Just put your email address down and your name, and she'll be able to officiate getting you signed up for the Danish Embassy reception. Should be quite a nice evening. I guess the highlight of the evening for me is Wilhelm Bohr, the grandson of Niels Bohr, will be a highlighted speaker for the evening. He's a good old friend and supporter who just lives up outside of Baltimore. He's actually a local. So with no further ado, let me introduce tonight's speaker to you. Patrick McCray was a postdoc here in the History Center back in the year 2000. And we have a number of other of our postdocs floating around through the crowd today, and a number of them working now in this area. So Patrick is going to be speaking about the time when the computer and the telescope met. Patrick.
Hello. Hi. I have many microphones on me. Can you hear me with all of them?
Very well.
Okay, good then. Well, thank you all for coming out. As Greg mentioned, my talk for you this evening is about when the telescope met the computer, and it deals with how astronomers and astronomy became digital. The talk that I'm presenting to you this evening started quite a while ago. I was, as Greg mentioned, a postdoc here from 2000 to 2003. I loved working here. This was one of my favorite places that I've worked during my career. And while I was a historian here at the Center for History of Physics, I was doing research for this book that was published about 14 years ago. It was called Giant Telescopes, a very subtle title. And it was about how astronomers mastered and mustered the technologies and finances to build a new generation of observatories. And as I was writing this book, one of the things that I became increasingly interested in wasn't just the politics of how big science facilities get built, but I was increasingly interested in and curious about how astronomers and how scientists did their jobs. Specifically, I was curious about how new technologies influenced and affected what it was like to be an astronomer. So today we have astronomers who are planning the next generation of giant telescopes, but oftentimes when you read about these telescopes in magazines like Physics Today or the FYI news that AIP puts out, they're notable not just for the size of their mirrors and things like that or their cost, but they're notable for the vast amounts of data that they're going to produce. So for example, this facility here, which will come online in a couple of years, called the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, it's notable for how much data and information it's going to produce. So the data stream from something like this will be sort of equivalent to you or me downloading a movie from Netflix about every few seconds all night long. So it's in facilities like this that we sort of see a new imagining of the telescope, not as a steel and glass explorer of the night sky, but a silicon-based factory of scientific data. And way back when I was a postdoc here at AIP, when I first started the research project I was interested in, my sense of what astronomers did was a little bit naive. I imagined that astronomy looked like this. The solitary astronomer, maybe not dressed quite so well in a suit and tie, but I imagined it being very much a solitary activity. But by now, of course, this imagery has long since become fiction. It's become history. Modern astronomy today is as much of a software challenge as it is one of building bigger telescopes. Where once astronomers complained that they didn't have enough data, by the 1980s, they were already complaining about drowning in it. Astronomers today routinely speak of data floods, data deluges, data explosions. And the implications of these massive data streams and data archives for science are profound. Today, being an astronomer doesn't necessarily mean working at a telescope. Instead, researchers query online databases. They're filled with petabytes of information that other scientists have collected. And this practice, of course, raises all sorts of questions about what it means to be a scientist. It raises questions about intellectual property and the ownership of one's work. And while this in itself is a relatively recent development, its roots go back many decades. So it's this transformation that I want to talk to you about this evening. It's a story about telescopes and how people use them, and it's also a story about the ways in which astronomers interact with, share, and use data. So my basic question when I started this project a few years ago was basically this: how did astronomy go from this to this? How did scientists adopt new technologies that allow data to be converted into a digital format and then manipulated, analyzed, and shared? In short, what I was interested in was, how did the sky become digital? Now, this meeting between the computer and the telescope was not some sort of impetuous fling, but rather it's best understood as a courtship that unfolded over several decades. And this marriage was brokered by a diverse community: observatory directors, scientists, electrical engineers, computer programmers. And it's been a productive relationship, but one that's also been infused with anxiety. So, to make all of this manageable in the 45 minutes or so that I have, what I'd like to be doing is presenting some examples that serve as windows into the social life of astronomical data. Now, the focus that I'm taking this evening is on observational optical astronomy, just simply because it's something that I'm most interested in. But optical astronomy is also the community that has the longest history relative to other fields like X-ray astronomy or radio astronomy. And it's also the field where scientists have the most ingrained practices and traditions. So the things I'll be talking about this evening can be broken down into several categories. We can think about the collection of data, its conversion, its standardization, its processing, and its archiving. But throughout the talk, I hope you'll see that there are two meta themes that connect these activities, ones which I'll keep coming back to. One of these is circulation. Over the course of several decades, scientists found ways to circulate data as well as the tools that they use to work with it. And if we can picture data moving about, we can also imagine something else closely associated with it. Let's call this thing data friction. Moving data costs time, energy, money, and attention. And scientists encounter resistance: social, technical, political, and financial resistance when they try to move their data around. How is this process lubricated to make less friction? The examples that I've chosen this evening depict local processes, but the importance of circulating data transcended individual scientists and their institutions. for astronomers, dealing with data was, in both senses of the phrase, a universal concern. So let's start in June 1948. The world's biggest telescope, the 200-inch on Palomar Mountain, was dedicated. Distinguished scientists, workmen, celebrities, Caltech trustees, members from the Carnegie Institution, all gathered inside the telescope's classically proportioned dome. But as I was doing my work, I was interested in what the experience of using a giant telescope like this was like around 1950. Most observation runs with the 200-inch or other telescopes like it were carried out of what was called the telescope's prime focus, in this case located about 75 feet above the primary mirror. Researchers sat in what ominously sounds like, ominously called the observer's cage, a cramped space about 6 feet in diameter, and they would sit there all night long taking exposures of the night sky. A single exposure might last all night. During this time, an astronomer continually looked through the eyepiece to keep the object centered properly. Data was typically recorded on glass photographic plates that perhaps the individual astronomer had personally prepared to increase their sensitivity. Another observing location was what was called the Cassegrain focus, located underneath the primary mirror. Imagine sitting here some 30 feet or so off the ground in total darkness underneath a 500-ton telescope that's slowly moving about you. Astronomers might have been sitting with their backs to the universe, but they still had to contend with the facts of life. This often meant cold observatory domes and postponing the call of nature. But by the late 1960s, this way of doing astronomy was already changing, and with it a sense of astronomers' professional identity. A main agent of this change was the digital computer. Astronomers embraced these machines amidst rapid technological change, what one business analyst in the 1960s called the go-go years for the computer industry. The classic mainframe computer was seen not just as a number cruncher, but part of a larger information gathering system. And this innovation, of course, was driven faster and further by the needs of business as well as the Cold War. By the end of the 1960s, smaller and simpler mini-computers challenged the mainframe's primacy. My point is that astronomers introduced the telescope to the computer during a time of tremendous technological change. In the 1960s, the first raindrops fell, which would become today's data floods. At the same time, the astronomy community itself was in the midst of great flux. More scientists, drawn by the space program and the overall Cold War expansion of science, entered the field, what one observatory director called the de-astronomization of astronomy, as people from other fields entered and became part of the astronomy community. This is a slide drawn from a report around 1970 showing the number of institutions that were offering degrees in astronomy. Now, you can get one glimpse of what some of these changes are like in this marriage between the telescope and the computer here in this architect's sketch. This was a drawing made in 1963 of a new telescope that was being planned for Palomar Mountain in the early 1960s. Its mirror size was not that large, it was only about 60 inches. But what made this new telescope interesting was that it would be augmented and complemented with the latest in sensitive and efficient electronic detectors. The idea being that this would allow observers to collect scientific data more quickly. This architect's sketch shown here reflected these assumptions. Here we see electronic devices on the telescope shown as being directly wired to a computer itself, the telescope already being plugged into computers that were sitting in the observatory dome itself. This today seems utterly ordinary, essentially converting analog data into digital data that could be stored for future use and manipulated in later calculations. So this is an example of converting astronomical data into a digital format. But what about making the data digital in the first place? In the mid-1960s, a new instrument at Caltech called a multi-channel spectrometer was being built. The basic design was done by a Canadian-born astronomer named John Beverly Oak, who was a staff scientist at Caltech. It was a very expensive machine. A lot of the money to build it came from the US military. And it cost, at the time, about the equivalent today of about $1 million. It was designed especially for use at that 200-inch telescope on Palomar Mountain. And as its name suggests, the multi-channel spectrometer collected spectra from stars and galaxies across a wide range of wavelengths. Engineers built the instrument so that it automatically, electronically, subtracted the background signal of the night sky from the object of interest. This was especially important because it was used to observe very faint objects like a faraway star or galaxy. Eventually, technicians at the Astroelectronics Lab linked this new spectrometer to a Raytheon mini computer system so that the information collected by the telescope was sent directly to a data room where it was then stored and analyzed. In other words, the data output was born digital. This was just one device in a veritable new zoo of instruments that were being developed in the 60s and 70s. The innovation that was happening was by no means limited to California. For example, in the midst of a swinging London scene at the London University College, a young astronomer named Alec Boxenberg unveiled his image photon counting system. This technological menagerie had an image tube at one end that intensified the light collected by the telescope. Boxenberg then coupled this to a television camera so it could show what the telescope was observing while also recording it. And then all of this information that was being collected was fed into a rack of digital processors. Here on the right, we see an example of the kind of imagery that this machine produced, where each of the little blips that you see there is the result of an individual photon hitting the image tube. Boxenberg's device also came with a loudspeaker that was attached to it, so you could actually hear the photons coming in as they arrived at the telescope's mirror and then were captured in the form of digital data. In 1973, Boxenberg brought this device with him, a very complicated thing to transport, to Palomar, where the system impressed Caltech's astronomers so much that they went about then trying to build their own equivalent of it and whetted appetites for similar machines. And of course, more machines like this were built. This proliferation of new electronic instruments soon offered astronomers a bewildering array of options. Consider this chart taken from a paper that Boxenberg wrote in 1975. Here at the top we have our happy little photon arriving here after traveling thousands of light years. And in the past, this photon simply would have been shunted off to one side and captured on a photographic plate. But by 1975, our happy little photon coming in faced a maze of options before being converted into astronomical data. Now eventually, because we are here in 2019, we know how this story ends. We know that charge-coupled devices, CCDs, became the dominant means for the ways in which astronomers collect their data. What I'm trying to illustrate is that at this particular point in time, there was a whole array of choices, technological choices that astronomers had to work with. It was by no means a foregone conclusion that CCDs were going to become the detector of choice. And this new array of electronic tools helped prompt a reconsideration of the telescope itself. This is an image taken from an article that Edward Dennison, the head of the Astroelectronics Lab that I mentioned earlier, presented at a conference in Geneva. What's interesting about this to me is that on one side of the drawing, set apart from boxes labeled teletype, 16K core memory, sits a lonely, curious icon, the telescope. Interesting. Before, the telescope was the centerpiece of the astronomer's working life. In this particular diagram, it's been literally marginalized. And some scientists who saw this at this conference in Geneva wondered if this represented a future where their once proud instrument would be banished to the periphery by computers. And in the 1970s, it was common at astronomy conferences to hear predictions about a future when scientists would no longer need to actually go to an observatory like some religious supplicant in the hopes of receiving good data. Other scientists, of course, reacted very sharply to such ideas and maintained that the best science was still done when scientists collected their own data using their own instruments. And at the heart of this hand-wringing, however, sits the data itself and questions about how to collect and how to manage it. The astronomy community was not the only one to experience such transformations. By the 1950s and 1960s, the tools used by high-energy physicists had also grown enormously in complexity, cost, and the amount of data that they generated. For many scientists, the data itself had become the experiment. Physicists relied on machines that could automatically measure particle tracks much faster than a human analyst. So these debates about ways to use scientific instruments were about professional identity as much as they were about technological change. These discussions reflected other issues within the nature of technological work itself and its gendered dimensions. For example, in the early days of the manned space program, hands-on flying was central to the test pilot's professional identity. As Neil Armstrong wrote in 1960, the vehicle is an instrument of the pilot. It depends on him for control and flight success. Not a view shared by NASA's engineers, who saw the primary task of the astronaut as systems management, not stick and rudder flying. And if we step back a little bit further, we can start to think about how this fits into the larger economies of science. For example, of course, there's the political economy of science, the politics of how the money needed to do science is acquired. But there's also something which historians refer to as a moral economy. Now, the idea of a moral economy goes back to the 1970s. A British historian named E.P. Thompson, who was interested, somewhat seemingly tangential to our story, but it's not, he was interested in British food riots. He was interested in how British peasants and soldiers behaved toward one another during these riots. At the essence, E.P. Thompson's work on moral economies was about rules for fairness, sharing, and about accepted norms for behavior. It was about how people should behave. Now, historians of science began to pick up these ideas, this language, and these concepts. For example, in the 1990s, historian of science Robert Kohler took this idea of how people should behave and extended it to scientists, specifically writing about the work of geneticist Thomas Hunt Morgan. Morgan, as some of you might know, won the Nobel Prize in 1933 for his work mapping chromosomes. Morgan worked primarily with fruit flies, breeding all sorts of variations into them. But Morgan also distributed and shared his fruit flies with other laboratories and other scientists. He established an expected set of behaviors that came with sharing his research materials. In other words, he created a moral economy in which there was an expected but unstated set of quid pro quos. If you were part of the scientific community, you learned and adopted these rules as part of your training of becoming a scientist. Now, this idea is also important in astronomy. What were the rules and expectations about how you shared your data? If you collected your data, were you obligated to share it with somebody, or was it yours? What were a scientist's professional and moral obligations? Now, in an era when data was collected principally on photographic plates, these could be shared, but sharing those plates was difficult. Those plates were fragile pieces of glass. You couldn't just put them in the mail and send them off. So oftentimes you would have to go to an observatory's plate archive and work with the data there. Now, once data becomes digital, it is, in theory, easier to share. But this, of course, then brings changes to astronomy's moral economy. Who do you share it with? Was it your data if you collected it at a public research facility? If you, for example, got an NSF grant and went to Kitt Peak, which is a nationally operated facility, is that your data, or is that data that the taxpayer has paid for? Related to that was the fact that by the time we get to the 1970s, the amount of data astronomers faced was becoming astronomical. At the same time, scientists increasingly wanted to combine data that was collected at different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. The problem they ran into, however, was that digital data at this time that was recorded by scientists, for example, using a radio telescope in Australia, was probably not compatible with that was collected at an optical observatory in California. Each of these institutions typically produced its own in-house software packages to read the special data format that their own instruments produced. There was no lingua franca for communicating this data with one another. In other words, significant data friction inhibited astronomers' ability to share research with colleagues or to combine data collected at different telescopes. Now today, of course, we have MP3 files and doc files and PDFs and things like that. Common file formats that allow us to share and exchange information. But astronomers didn't have this in the 1970s. They didn't have a common file format that they could use to share their digital data. So in 1976, a small group of astronomers began working out the details of a standardized way to share these digital files. Their underlying goal was to provide a standardized, simple, and extensible means to transport data between computers, between image processing systems, and between different observatories. And they developed something called the Flexible Image Transport System. In the United States, one of the people who took the lead role in this, a bald-headed man here looking at the computer named Donald Wells, who had started his career as a research astronomer at Kidd Peak National Observatory, who gradually shifted into information management and data handling. And in 1976, he meets a Dutch radio astronomer, and the two of them are discussing this problem of moving data around and sharing it and circulating it and the obstacles that they face. And the two of them begin to work out a plan to develop a provisional data format system. Neither of them was especially committed to the particular format that they had personally designed. As Wells wrote his colleague, "I believe that any well-defined and widely accepted format is infinitely preferable to none." His Dutch colleague agreed, noting that they needed some general purpose scheme that would also get as many scientists to buy into it as possible. And what we see is that by the end of 1980, various national observatories in Australia, in the United States, and Europe had begun to adopt FITS as their basic data format. And of course, as you can imagine, as more scientists begin to adopt the data format, the more popular it becomes. It becomes somewhat of a snowball effect. And this, of course, reaches its denouement in 1982 when the International Astronomical Union officially adopts FITS as the data standard that astronomical observatories should recognize and support. It becomes the standard global interchange format for digital data. FITS becomes, in other words, a potent oil that could reduce the friction inherent with the circulation of information of all kinds. Now, FITS, this file format that astronomers developed, which is still used today, provided the means for scientists to share the data they collected within their own institutions, across different wavelength regimes, and between observatories. But it only resolved part of the problem, because having data is just the first step. Data is not science. Data has to be processed and turned into science. So when an astronomer finished an observing run, they would often go back to their observatory, back to the university office, and they would write their own software code to process their own data. So what you had then was a tremendous duplication of effort, as scores of astronomers were writing scores of data programs to process their own individual information. Now, for British astronomers, they found this situation especially acute. In the 1970s, the British national investment in astronomy was substantial, and they were expecting several new research facilities to come online, which only exacerbated the sense among British scientists that they were facing an impending data management crisis. So starting in late 1978, a small group of astronomers in the UK, led by a man by the name of Michael Disney, who was an astronomer at Cardiff University, no relationship to the filmmaker, began putting together a plan to develop a data infrastructure that British scientists could use, based on a central node in a network that other sites would be linked to. This central node would serve as a switching center for the communications. The staff at this central point would service the network, update the computer systems, and make sure the software for processing astronomical data was adequately documented and kept up to date. And the idea was that software processing programs that were developed at other institutions, for example, Cardiff, or Oxford, or Cambridge, would be shared within this central network. So if a scientist at Cambridge develops a killer application for processing astronomical data, they will freely share this on this network so that other astronomers can use this. I think you see the problem that some scientists might have with this. How do you convince people to share that killer application that they have developed to do their own particular very good science? So this system called StarLink goes online in October of 1980. It was a very expensive investment by the British government. It was done by leasing telephone lines from the Britain's post office, which connected the different centers together, connected by these things which you've probably heard of called fax computers. And interestingly enough, the common data format that was used to allow the data to flow through the system was that FITS format that I referred to earlier. So you can see how these systems begin to become linked with one another. Now, FITS was developed by astronomers who learned computing skills. StarLink was different. It was built by computer engineers. Now, the astronomers and the computer programmers quickly came to realize that their priorities for this system were not always compatible. As one British scientist told me, we were driven by reality. The computer people wanted to build a Rolls-Royce for use later on, while we, the scientists, simply wanted a Honda that worked right away. I suspect if I had talked to the computer engineers, I would have perhaps gotten a different side of that story. But some sense of this tension between the programmers, the computer engineers, and the astronomers can be seen in the newsletters that the StarLink program published. Cartoons featuring, not my name, Captain Starling appeared in many issues. Although meant as a joke, a closer look at them shows some of the issues that the computer programmers faced. Captain Starling was portrayed as a computer whiz, not an astronomer, whose true abilities were hampered by the constant demands of the technologically unsophisticated astronomers. In other words, while the astronomers simply wanted to go out and look at the pretty night sky and analyze the data that they collected, Captain Starling wanted to program. Here he's shown on the right, confronting a deranged scientist whose demands are silenced by simply gagging him with a hefty manual of software documentation. By the end of the 1970s, astronomers' basic research materials were increasingly born digital, or otherwise being converted into digital form. Although these new tools and standards help reduce friction inherent in sharing digital tools, they help create new frictions. The digitization of astronomy and other scientific disciplines introduced new kinds of experts and expertise. Astronomers were obliged to become familiar with new forms of knowledge and technologies, just as new specialists, who ideally acted as bridges between research and computer engineering, were being brought into the picture as well. Collaboration was necessary. Not surprisingly, friction resulted as these communities sometimes had different motivations and goals. All of this is well reflected in this cartoon shown here. It asks, quote, who should wear the pants in astronomical image processing, and shows the delicate balance between competition and team spirit. But clearly someone has the upper hand here. Now perhaps it's just a coincidence, but the astronomer is the one armed with a knife. Now everyone knows you don't take a knife to a gunfight. My final example considers what happens to all of this data. Where does it go, and what do astronomers do with it? And here I want to draw a parallel to what historians do. People like me can come to a great place like this, they can go to the archives at the Center for History of Physics, and we can find all sorts of evidence collected in the past about the past that we can use now in the present to write histories for the future about the past. Good. This evidence, old journals, oral histories, books, correspondence, it's the raw material historians use. And thanks to organizations like the AIP, this data, and there's no other word for it, will be available for use in the future. Now, astronomy is an observational science, but it's also a historical one. Data that was collected years ago, decades ago, can, for one purpose, can be, in principle, used by scientists today for entirely different research programs. And astronomy is also a science of the archive. These images here are of the plate archives at the Carnegie Observatory in Pasadena. Some of these were collected over 100 years ago, but they're still valuable for doing science. You can do interesting things by asking different questions that people 100 years ago would never have thought of. This river of digital information has enabled the creation of vast databases. They might not be plate archives, they might be digital repositories, publicly accessible databases. As a result, it's no longer necessary to use one's own data in order to do good science. A great example of this can be seen with the Hubble Space Telescope. In 2003, information managers at the Space Telescope Science Institute reviewing data usage statistics noticed something interesting. The total number of publications that astronomers had produced using Hubble data the previous year was just under 600. But for the first time, half of these refereed papers used archived Hubble data, and this percentage only continued to climb. Even more notable was the fact that 40% of Hubble publications used only archived data. So 40% of those 600 papers were written by people who simply went to the data archive, downloaded data, and did science with it. Now this, of course, represents a profound shift in the relationship between the astronomer and the telescope. Here the researcher need no longer be a producer of scientific data, but rather can simply be a consumer of it. It also says something about the nature of data. Hubble, as you know, is a public facility paid for with tax dollars. Any astronomer can apply for observing time. And as a result, from the initial planning of Hubble in the late 70s, in fact, in 1982, the recently deceased Riccardo Giacconi decided that Hubble data would have a one-year proprietary period. After that, then it would become a public good, available for the entire scientific community to use. This was, of course, very different from the policy of privately owned observatories like Palomar, where the answer seemed quite different. The scientists owned his or her data. With Hubble and other public facilities, the story is necessarily different. So this question about how the data would become available, when it would be available to the community at large, how it could be converted into a public good is also part of our story when we think about scientists and data. Here's a stunning example of this policy's efforts. In late 1995, Hubble Space Telescope took 342 exposures of a small region of the night sky in the constellation Ursa Major. Since then, the Hubble Deep Field has become an iconic scientific image. The thousands of jewel-like galaxies revealed here are reproduced on everything from calendars to coffee cups. The resulting data, produced and archived, however, was immediately released to eager astronomers and public wonderment. It was not just born digital, it was born public. Scientists used the shared data that was released about a week after the data was collected to have since produced hundreds of refereed papers. And far from being the property of a single investigator, the Hubble Deep Field was presented as a shared community resource for all scientists to benefit from. So over the past half-century, a new generation of eyes, flesh and blood, glass and steel, has turned to the cosmos. Telescopes today still produce new and exciting knowledge about the universe, and yet scientists use them in a manner that is radically different. However, as I said, without data, there is no science. It is the foundation on which science is built. The sharing and circulation of data, however, demands an increasing fraction of researchers' time, money, and expertise. And all of these activities that I've described to you this evening were embedded in a larger framework of circulation and sharing, and conditioned by astronomy's political as well as moral economies. Now, to be sure, while new technologies can help reduce data friction, they cannot by themselves eliminate its accompanying social friction. Not all astronomers, in other words, want to share. Now, to paraphrase Shakespeare, that particular fault lies not in the stars, but in ourselves. A half-century ago, the telescope gradually merged with the computer into a hybrid instrument. Digital data alone did not remake astronomy. Scientists pursued these new tools to fulfill a desire for increased research efficiency and the ability to share data, to move it about more easily. Like all technological choices, going digital and being digital came with trade-offs as older ways of doing science changed. We jump ahead 3 decades, and today, an astronomer's daily routine looks strikingly familiar to mine and probably yours. They come to the office in the morning, they turn on their computers, and they get to work. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Questions from the audience?
Thank you, Patrick. It really was a fun talk to listen to. You talk about kind of the economies of data kind of dissemination and sharing and these kinds of things, and that's perfectly consistent with a lot of the history of science and internationalism during the 20th century. But I'm wondering, given the kind of digitalization, I guess, or the digitization of data, I'm wondering about what are the economies of significant discoveries? And I immediately thought of the recent event on the moon. There was a flash of light, and an astronomer kind of jumped up and saw that there was this flash, and a meteor apparently hit the moon in the last couple of days with the blood moon. And I'm wondering, is that what significant discovery looks like in this age of kind of data? Is when the computer alarms you to an important event, you jump to it, and then potentially, is that even of significance anymore? And so that kind of leads me to the question, what is significance if every astronomer has access to the same kinds of data in such amounts?
So I mean, the one thing I didn't really spend any time talking about is how all these new technologies enable better communication. So, you know, I can easily, you know, this, I vaguely recall reading about this, but I can sort of see, you know, astronomer X observes this, announces it, it's on Twitter, and you can sort of imagine the various modes of communicating this. I don't know the scientist who he or she was who collected this, or what happened with that data, or what institution they were, or how it becomes available, but clearly you're describing a situation whereas before astronomers would communicate through telegrams and things like that about, you know, a significant event happening. You know, this, of course, allowing for a much rapid way of disseminating information. Oddly enough, the parallel that I'm thinking about is a surfing one. And work with me here for a second. I know I'm from California. This is going somewhere. This idea that all scientists would have access to this kind of reminds me of debates among surfers as you have the development of very sophisticated wave pool technology for surfing competitions, where the goal is to create the exact same wave over and over, so the surfers can be evaluated on their ability as surfers, as opposed to, she got a good wave and she didn't, and yet we somehow still have to evaluate them. So there's kind of a weird democratization effect that happens there, as all people in theory have access to the exact same thing. I somehow suspect I haven't answered your question, but I gave it a good try.
First, this question up front.
Hi. A number of years ago, Gertz Herpa looked at the Strasbourg group of astronomers, a large group who split up into groups, some of whom actually went and did observations in South America, and others who stayed home. And he then analyzed how the two different groups treated the data. And all I can dimly remember is that there were some differences, but I was wondering, have you followed that at all?
I'm familiar with this paper, and the thing that strikes me is a generational difference. So one of the people that I interviewed whenever I was doing this research was Walt Sargent, who passed away as I was in the process of writing up one of the articles that came out of this. And, you know, he was very much that old school Palomar, my data, you know, and pointed, you know, with some degree of pride to the, you know, file drawers in his office that were full of unanalyzed data, you know, of data that he had collected. And, you know, I can understand that perspective, but I can also understand the perspective of someone who's not at Caltech, who doesn't have access to the file drawer of the data that's gone unanalyzed, and wishes that they had access to it. But the thing that stuck in my mind was, I was totally a different project, but I was visiting Stanford and happened to just sit across in the cafeteria I was staying at the Stanford Linear Accelerator guest house. And I was sitting across from this table to an astronomer, and you know, what do you do? I'm an astronomer. Oh, what kind? Oh, an observational astronomer. Am I, you know, because I like telescopes. I was like, well, you know, what's your favorite observatory? And he looked kind of puzzled. He goes, well, I don't go to the telescope. So I mine the archives. And yet he self-identified as an observational astronomer. So that difference, between Wall Sargent and this person was probably about 40-some years. But they clearly identified as being had the same professional identity, but their approach to doing the work was completely radically different and also mediated through entirely different sets of technologies.
Right, and it would be great to do an analysis, especially that mountain of Hubble publications, to do an analysis of the ones that were direct observation and let's say, data mining.
Yeah, and just...
Do you know anybody doing that?
I don't, but I mean, you're pointing out one of the great things is all of those 600x papers that were published can all be easily accessed through ADS. I mean, this simply is someone, young people, who are interested in this particular topic and would like to follow us up because it wouldn't be too hard to access those. It would also be interesting, and again, super easy, go to the original Hubble Deep Field paper, find all these citations to it, and then look at some sort of analysis of how that data is being used and circulated again as a public good.
Next question back here.
I'd like to follow up on a theme he started, but didn't go as far as I'd like to go, which is since there's so much data and nobody can look at it all, and the analysis of data is done by software, eventually we're going to get to the situation where most scientific, including here astronomical discoveries, are being made by software. And how do we recognize when a discovery is made, and how do we recognize the significance of those discoveries? I'm just curious whether you've given any thought to that.
Not so much from like a philosophical point of view, although it is sort of an interesting philosophy of science kind of question. The thing that comes to mind is I have a colleague in the UC system who is an observational astronomer, doesn't just do data mining and archiving, but actually goes and uses the Keck telescopes in Hawaii. And he's very much interested in Einstein lensing and that kind of thing. And he was telling me about a project that he was involved with. It was a large team collaboration project, which again is another thing which we haven't even mentioned, but this idea that, again, this image of the 1950s of the lone observer, Alan Sandage or whatever, by himself, and let's face it, almost all guys at this point in time, being replaced by larger and larger teams of scientists. The thing that struck me in my colleagues' work was they were actually setting up a protocol because so much of their data was being analyzed via software algorithms and things like that, is they were actually introducing false data into their data stream with the hope of developing algorithms that would sense it and weed it out. So they were actually deliberately polluting their own data with the idea then of detecting it. And they would also put these data sets online sort of as test objects for other astronomical groups to use to sort of test their data processing algorithms. And this idea just struck me as kind of perverse, but also pretty fascinating, this idea that you would create these false signals, but then at the same time you have LIGO, for example. This was fairly routine among LIGO that they would sort of send out false signals to make sure that the software that they had would be actually detecting the real signal whenever a gravitational wave event happened.
Next question here.
Oh, and then
with this deluge of data, scientists are increasingly turning towards artificial intelligence to analyze the data, one might say, although they're not sure how the artificial intelligence programs actually work.
Yeah.
But that introduces a new step in the data stream, in the sense that before it gets to the human, it's processed even more, and now by a computer that is doing something that we don't fully understand.
Yeah.
So do you think that that is the way the future goes?
It's always dangerous to ask the historian the future question. I guess my two comments would simply be that's a problem that is definitely not unique to astronomy. I mean, this is something we're all facing in a whole array of different areas. I think the other thing that is salient is that, and for much of this history that I've described here, I've described sort of this transition from astronomers writing their own programs that, personal software packages that they knew because they had lovingly created them themselves, to then that task becoming one for professional computer programmers and computer scientists, to now talking with graduate students who are getting these sort of black box programs and using it. And I don't think that's particularly different from any other fields of science, but of course you are describing a problem where you are given a increasingly exponentially expanding amount of data that has to be processed, so you're using tools that are readily available. And I definitely have talked to astronomers, oftentimes older ones, who do kind of worry about this black boxing, and their students not really fully understanding what's actually happening under the hood. But then if I press them on this a little bit, they don't really have a good solution to it because you see the problem. Yeah.
So you raised the question of gender,
Yes.
and then you dropped it.
Not entirely, but okay.
So is there any gender in your story with your massive data?
I mean, are you asking whether the people who are handling the data tend to be sort of like the computers of yore back at Harvard College Observatory? Is that where
I'm
you're
asking what's going on.
What's going on? Well, I mean, I think what you would see if you were to look at this more closely in terms of the community, and I've certainly interviewed and talked to as many male astronomers as female astronomers, is that that reflects the increasing diversity within the astronomy community itself. Before we all came into this room, I was speaking with someone outside about the decadal surveys for astronomy that are underway. In fact, the new one is starting recently. And one of the questions was, how influential are these? And part of my answer to that was, since the 1960s when these started, the astronomy community has become much more diverse in terms of race, in terms of gender, in all sorts of ways that people in the 1960s couldn't have imagined. So I guess my answer to that is when I look at the people who are working with astronomical data today, they reflect the increasing diversity of the astronomy community itself, which certainly has a long way to go, but I think compared to other fields of science, it certainly has committees and subcommittees devoted to thinking about and addressing those sorts of issues.
Hi, David Cecilia, University of Maryland. Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. So let me kind of test out something that I think might be an implication of your talk, and that is how digitization changed what observational astronomers did and how they gained. I mean, I like what you did about the sort of competitive versus cooperative dynamic. On how an astronomer gained a competitive advantage. It seems to me that maybe in the pre-digital phase, your story tells us that a lot of it was about sort of monopolizing data in the way that, say, a realtor uses the multiple listing service, right? But now it's harder to do that. And so, I'm thinking of what happened in the practice of history when computers came along, right? So economic historians, for instance, started to focus more and more not on just sort of quantitative history, but econometric history. And really what they built their reputations on was the elegance of their models, right? So is that a big trend that happens? Whereas you're getting your competitive advantage as an astronomer early on through the control of data, and later on through the elegance of your model and how you are analyzing widely available data.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, if you go back to the 40s or 50s, if you were an observational astronomer, your competitive advantage came from having access to big telescopes. And at that time, the big telescopes were privately owned and controlled. Jump to the 60s and 70s for optical astronomy, and you begin to see publicly available facilities and that sort of thing. The part about your question, though, I think, which is interesting, and I actually hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it just now, is, I started this talk by referencing a book that I started writing almost 2 decades ago in this building. And at that time, I was collecting my data, doing oral histories on, tapes. You could stick a pencil in.
We don't take tapes anymore.
Yeah, you're right. I know. But I mean, my process for working at that time was extremely analog. And I jump ahead to when I did this research for the talk that I presented to you this evening, which I did a couple of years ago, and almost all of my sources were digital sources. I spent a little time at the Caltech archive, opening up boxes, whatever, but almost all of the information that I used was itself digital, or digitized in some format or other. And as I'm thinking through your question, and I'm thinking through my own process, it's actually very interesting because I think this is something that people who've been doing history for a long time, and we have our own self-reflective aspect about this. My own ways of doing history have changed, so much in the same way as being an astronomer has changed. Being a historian who's been reading about this has also changed in really dramatic ways. The difference, I guess, I would say is that whenever I started thinking about this, I was fortunate enough, my competitive advantage came from being a postdoc here and having time and money and resources to go off to Caltech for a month or go off to Hawaii for 2 weeks and hang out with astronomers and watch them while they worked and whatever, that other people might not have had access to. Whereas now a lot of those resources are more publicly available, which is frankly, I think, a very good thing. But thanks, I'm actually going to be thinking about that a little bit more because whenever I go back to California, I have to start teaching a graduate seminar thinking about historical methods, and this is something to think about.
Thank you, this is wonderful. Not to be too much of a historiographical throwback, but some of what you were saying reminded me of some of what I had read in Bruno Latour's Laboratory Life. I mean, given the different networks of astronomers and the different nature of the data, can you speak to what extent some of these results would be socially constructed? I realize that may be an outdated term, but what you found to that extent.
So I guess one way of thinking about that is, again, I don't mean to make this about me, but since I'm standing here talking, I might as well. One thing to think about is when I started working on this project 2 decades ago, David's going to hate hearing this, but I didn't actually think about this from a historical point of view. I was interested in more as an ethnography. I really started this project by wanting to hang out with scientists and to see what they did, because I had read books by Bruno Latour and other people who were doing scholarship from that particular time period. That really intrigued me. The thing that really caught for me was my realization that I couldn't really do good anthropology of science, good ethnography, good STS work without having a solid grounding in history, and I don't seem to have really left that particular thing, so, too bad for me. But the idea of this being socially constructed, I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean with the question itself.
I mean, the data obviously comes from different sources, embedded in different social networks. I just was wondering if you addressed that question.
Okay.
I mean, at all.
Yeah, I mean,
to the extent it's still being raised in the field.
Yeah. I think the thing that really stands out for me, and this kind of goes back to an earlier question about competitive advantage, was how limited you were in the 1950s if you didn't have access to certain facilities. And looking at that particular history, reading the correspondence between astronomers in that particular period of time, how limited they felt if they didn't have access to Carnegie, Caltech, certain European telescopes, things like that. So that kind of goes back to the point we talked about earlier about the sort of democratization of the field. I'm a little uncomfortable with that because, democratization, of course, is a sliding scale, but there's certainly much greater access. The networks for doing these things is certainly different than they were in the 1950s, which, coming back to Debbie's point, was very much an old boys network or a boys network in the 50s, 60s, persisting up into the 70s and 80s, in terms of not just who had access to the data, but who actually was allowed to go to a telescope and collect data in the first place. And that's a very different set of things. It's a different research question, I think. But anyway, that's not what I was going to say.
The next question's here too.
Oh, hey.
Patrick, thank you. That was fascinating.
As you were talking about kind of your own shift from analog to digital, it reminded me of some of the debates that happen in history about what historians lose when we don't go to archives. That there's a very strong feeling among, I think, particularly older historians, that if you're not actually handling the documents, you're losing something important with the work. Do you see any parallels to that in astronomy, where people are thinking, if you're not looking through a telescope, how is it astronomy?
Yeah, I guess I've been doing my job for 20 years, so I guess I can sound a little nostalgic or whatever. But yeah, there is something you can lose. This is a conversation I have with my students all the time, because to them, accessing journals is accessing them online, and I say, go read the recent paper in ISIS by Lindy Baldwin. They go and they read the paper by Lindy Baldwin, and like, did you look on what was the other side of it? No, I just went about that. Like, well, but you've missed the picture, or you're missing the opportunity for serendipity. And that, I think, is one of the key things that is lost. And I think, again, not to wax romantic, but I've interviewed enough astronomers across a sufficiently wide age range to have encountered a large number of them, now mostly older, who have a very romantic or lost romantic view of doing astronomy. And again, it's a very highly gendered approach to this. The metaphors that they use tend to be ones of, cowboys, lassoing data. I'm not making this up. Cowboys lassoing data and things like that. But it's very much this image of being alone at night with this big machine, doing your science. You can, extend whatever. And that image is much less prevalent today. I think it's still there in various ways, but there's the romance of sitting in front of a computer is a little bit different than, So I think there really are parallels, and I think the astronomers that I've spoken with have talked about that. The feeling for the organism sense that you would get if you were there collecting the data itself. I haven't really met any of them, though, who wanted to go back to those days, which is the thing that always struck me as interesting. When I would say, well, would you like to go back to the observing cage where you don't get to pee for 12 hours because you can't get out? They're like, a few of them might think about it, but most of them seem pretty happy with the technological change and the belief in the ability to do their science more efficiently. And there's something also about the efficiency aspect, which was the more pressure you have on observatories for observing time, the ability to complete a research program in 2 hours versus 4 hours means that somebody else can come in and use that for the other 2 hours. So you can sort of imagine the pressure on observatory directors to operate their own observatories much like factories of data. And that actually is a phrase that you hear over and over, that they're simply, they're data factories. They're like a high energy particle physics experiment, where they're just simply churning out a highly corrected beam of light that is directed to a detector that's recorded in computer. But the issue, though, how it affects historians and how we think about our own, that's an interesting one.
Can you go that way?
To the center by the
There you go. Thank you.
I wandered too far. Sorry.
The next question is over here.
Thank you. Thank you for your research, and thank you for sharing your research. So I know you started out by saying you were scoping your research and scoping your talk around optical. And my question is about whether your research or your instinct, your insights are telling you that there's some additional delta to be had with the computational capacity across astronomy domains. We know from history that some of the edges of new ideation, new concrete models comes from where areas meet, like in radio astronomy, comparing radio signals and optical signals to identify markers for gravitational lenses. Did you see that in your research, and can you say something about the accelerating power of the data in our ability to see across the spectrum?
Okay, so obviously I'm not a practicing astronomer, so this is based on intuition and a sense of talking. So one of the things that I saw during the course of talking to scientists across many generations, of course, today it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but it's with the emergence of multi-wavelength astronomy, which again, to someone who's entering the field now or probably has been in the field for 20 years, is like, duh. Of course you're going to take, but that in of itself was a major shift, I think, that you begin to see happening in the 60s and 70s. And of course, this ability to take this data from these different observatories at different wavelengths and to combine them to look at a particular object, strikes me as a fairly significant sort of development. And again, coming back, this is very much on anecdotal evidence, but again, talking to graduate students and postdocs in astronomy at my own institution, they tend, at least the ones I've talked to, tend not to have any sort of wavelength chauvinism. To use that phrase, they're astronomers, full stop, they're not optical, they might work preferentially in certain wavelengths, but they seem very comfortable in doing data mashups, if you will.
Sure. The next question right beside.
Right. So one of the things I was wondering, Patrick, is this sharing, is it partly influenced by the size of the community? Because, the astronomy community has remained fairly static for the last few decades. there's, what, 2,000 to 3,000 members of the American Astronomical Society.
Yeah.
And tied into a point that Lindy was making, I always remember the case with the Hubble Space Telescope, where they gave 3 different sets of astronomers the same data set and came up with 3 completely incompatible conclusions over what the data were showing them. There's still some specialization within the community itself in actually interpreting and understanding the data that they're getting.
Yeah. For sure, the period of time that I was speaking about this evening was about the time period when the astronomy community itself was growing rapidly. So sort of like I had those 2 slides where I was talking about the technological change, but also the demographic change. We're certainly seeing the technological change happening in the last kind of 15, 20 years, but we're certainly not, we're not seeing the accompanying demographic shift in quite the same way. So I'm not quite sure how to answer the question, but when I sort of look at the 2 things that catalyze this transformation I'm talking about, one of them doesn't seem to be quite as present and prevalent as it was, say, for example, in the 1960s.
Yeah. To my knowledge, we have 3 questions coming still. Hands for people who have questions. 1, 2, 3. Okay, number 4 and number 5. Okay, number 1 is here.
Patrick, I wonder what the impact was on astronomical education.
Yeah.
I remember in the mid-60s, when we were sending data directly to the computer, it removed a lot of the nuts and bolts sort of stuff. We were doing binary stars, and it drew these light curves.
Yeah.
And we could go right to analysis.
Yeah.
And therefore accelerated the research as undergraduates. I was just wondering, did it form an accelerator for education, being able to do this?
It changed, of course, the requisite skills that one needed to have. I think probably in the same way whenever astronomy becomes astrophysics, that again, the skill set needed to do astronomy changes. The other thing that I mentioned, of course, then you have the influx of people from other fields into astronomy. One of the things that I didn't mention in the talk, but it's in an article that I wrote, is how astronomical data is frequently used by scientists, by people doing big data research for a variety of reasons. Astronomical data, they would argue, is not political. It's not like climate change data, which has, it's also not commercial, so it's not like data from Amazon or Walmart that has any commercial value. So for people who are doing, working with big data sets, oftentimes, at least based on the interviews and things that I've read, they will turn to astronomical data because it's a nice model object for them to work with because it doesn't have any of that icky social stuff associated with it. Now, of course, we know that it does, but they don't know that it does or pretend not to. But to answer the question about education, one of the things I guess that I noticed, of course, coming back to Paul's point, the size of the astronomy community is not changing rapidly, yet there's still lots of people studying it. What do they do when they finish their degrees? And again, based on anecdotal things, they go to Wall Street, do quantitative data work there. Oftentimes they graduate and they're data scientists. They're really good at coding and Python and things like that. So the skill set that they've acquired by working with astronomical data has provided them with this skill set, much the same way as someone who gets a PhD in history and can't get it, is not working as a historian, but has a set of skills that they can apply to a whole array of other things. I see something very similar to that. And of course, this all then ties into larger things about job markets, demographics, and economies.
Mark?
I have a million questions relating to quality. I mean, for example, if you have a large data set and you own it, and you sit on it and try to digest it over a long period of time, knowing that no one else is going to see it, can you get something out of it by thinking about it longer, not worrying about someone coming and taking it from you? Or the fact is it open up and hundreds of people go look at the same data set and one of them is likely to see something that you did not see. Has there been any studies on whether it is data sharing versus data holding results in higher quality output?
Since this is being filmed, I'm not really sure I want to directly answer that. But I can think of a couple, I can think of an anecdote. I won't name any names, but I definitely recall interviewing an astronomer who had requested that the proprietary time for his publicly generated observational data be extended. And it was a very large data set that had required a lot of telescope time, a lot of very expensive telescope time. And the pillaring that he received from his colleagues was interesting because, again, going back to that idea of a moral economy, there was this idea that you received $1 gazillion to do this research. You had access to it for the same amount of time that everybody else gets access to it, and now you want more time? What's up with that? And I don't believe that time was granted to him, but it was an interesting way of seeing this informal policing by the community itself of its own standards for rules and behavior for sharing.
But my question is, when his data was released, did anybody do anything more useful with it than he did?
I can't say that they did anything more interesting than he or she did with it, but I will say that the main obstacle for them not wanting to see it become publicly available was the anxiety that that would happen. And that's as much as I want to say.
Okay, next question in the center.
Patrick, thank you for this talk. I'm Tom Zeller from the University of Maryland. I wanted to come back to an answer to a question that was raised earlier about romanticizing the pre-digital age. And I was struck by that because both the pre and the post-digital data is technologically mediated, right? I mean, the pre-digital age, we have massive telescopes, you know that better than I, and there are several steps in between what's being observed and what's being written down. And the same is true, obviously, in the digital age. So I'm thinking whether you could sort of zoom out a little bit and reflect on the changes in astronomy that happened in the 19th century with the introduction of photography. So would you say, as a historian, that this is a bigger change in the field than the introduction of photography? Say yes or no.
No. I mean, obviously they required very different skill sets, and there were scientists in the 19th century who had those skills and adapted and rolled with those changes and did very well and produced high quality science, and there were those who didn't. One of the people that I mentioned in my talk, the gentleman who ran the Astroelectronics Laboratory, Edward Dennison, I didn't, as you may have noticed, say what happened to him. He was fired from Caltech, and he was fired because he couldn't keep up with the technological changes that were happening. He was hired in 1963. His knowledge of electronics was very much a 1950s, ham radio, the skills that he acquired as a teenager into his 20s that he brought with him to this job. And when he was eventually let go in the mid-1970s, there's a very telling set of letters, going back to Lindy's point, letters, between him and Horace Babcock, who let him go, about the skill set that he had and what he didn't have. And he was very honest about, he was angry about being let go, but he was very honest about what he could do and what he couldn't do. And he acknowledged that he just simply had not been able to keep up with integrated circuits and transistors and all of these things. He describes himself as good at managing projects, but in terms of like really understanding them, he was quite honest in saying, you know, I haven't been able to keep up with this. So, you know, the era of CCDs and things like that, you know, was coming in at that time, and you know, he went back to doing something else. So I'm not really sure that's getting to your question about the nature of the change, but I think when you have these shifts from the photographic turn to the electronic turn to the digital turn, you have people, I think, who are very good and have the skill set that can manage and handle that, and you have some people, you know, as we see in all sorts of technologized jobs today who don't have those skill sets.
I think that you partially answered this question earlier, but part of the reason I think that the data and volume expands so rapidly is partly, you know, the volume of it, the speed of it, but also the nature of it. Because, you know, you used to have 1 bit per pixel, yes, no photon. Right now you have 8 or 256 or whatever. How do you think that affects the degree to which students feel, you know, looking at the field of astronomy, that that's accessible to them, especially if you're looking at physicists, you know, physicists like their pen and paper, like, who feel that they aren't really computer people, looking at astronomy thinking that's a computer thing now. How do you think that affects people, you know, who may previously have gone into astronomy and been great physicists and mathematicians who are now being lost?
Yeah. I think the question, if you want to turn it a little bit, is maybe asking why people go into astronomy. Are they going into it because they want to become good data scientists, and this is a path to doing that because you have a nice clean data set that you can work with, or because you're fundamentally asking astronomical, astrophysical sorts of questions? And I guess I've been thinking about this in terms of talking to my own students in history, in terms of liking the pen and paper, being more comfortable mining a database, doing a version of cliometrics, or addressing problems in those sorts of ways. And it also kind of ties back to a question that was asked earlier by Mark about the nature of the education that the people are getting. So, you know, maybe the issue isn't so much the questions or the issues that people are having who are going into the field now, but it's the people who are advising them and mentoring them, you know, who maybe are working with a different sort of technological paradigm and are struggling to function in a world where you have petabytes of data accessible online. You have a gazillion every paper on astronomy ever published through the ADS, and you can mine those and work with those in a very different sort of way. So I guess I like to think about this maybe in terms of the analogies and parallels to students who are doing history of science and the resources that they have available to them versus, you know, what I had whenever I started out.
Okay, that was a really rich set of questions. Thanks to everyone in the audience, and thanks to the speaker. So I'm caught in between this digital analog divide myself right now. I just got a notice on my Track It software on my iPhone that my new box of